All right, my people, my brothers and sisters. All right, we're going to be reading a reference history of the world from the earliest times to present. Part 1, World History. Part 2, National Histories. There are maps, tables, photographers, and an exhaustive index by Albert Bushnell-Hart in collaboration with William Scott Ferguson, Charles Howard, McIlwain, Everett Kimball, Bernadotte, Everly Schmidt, Milton Conover. So this is coming out of the Merriam-Webster dictionary. All right, so preface. The history of the world was first included as a special feature in the reference history edition of Webster's New International Dictionary, published in 1909. The original outline was prepared by Horace E. Scudder and John Clark Ridpath, assisted by other distinguished scholars. This outline was subsequently revised and enlarged by Edward A. Grosvenor of Amherst College. For the edition of 1921, the general editor was Albert Bushnell Hart, who, in this revision of 1934, now returns to the task of bringing into proper focus, with the best of expert aid, the eventful period since the breaking out of the World War in 1914. The World War and the events following it presented a new series of data which required special attention for the preparation of the revised edition of 1934. So we're going on to the effect of the World War. This meant not only a careful selection of the events to be included in the plan, but also a change of emphasis. For that war, with its consequent readjustments, resulted not only in new states, but in new political and social ideas. Hence, in this edition, are recorded in much detail the tremendous events of that world struggle involving as it did incidents of great significance in the development of the world, and also a new valuation of the previous events which slowly but inevitably led up to the great crisis of the war. The decade and a half since the end of active hostilities and the rapid shaping of the results rising from the Treaty of Versailles have made necessary a careful and detailed study of that period. So this is the post-war period, one which has been almost as significant and changeful as the previous 5 years of hostilities. The most significant enlargement of the previous methods of the reference history is to be found in the very careful study of the condition of the world in the period since the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. It is too soon to make elaborate deduction on this apparent change in the aspirations, motives, and methods of many modern governments. Nevertheless, this part of the work is a distinct addition to previous editions of the history, in that it deals with the effects of the World War, of the Treaty of Versailles, and of the recent revolutions in several of the most important countries in the world. The material is particularly useful to those who desire to know how far the process of the political reorganization of the world has gone and what the difficulties of such reorganization are. The twofold plan. In this revision, the editors have carried out the plan adopted in the previous edition, namely a division of the work into two main parts. Part 1, World History, treating the periods of history from the earliest times to the present, and Part 2, National Histories, treating the histories of all existing countries. Under the title World History is included a summarized history of 5 great chronological epochs of Western civilization, systematized into corresponding sections, namely Ancient to 476 AD, Medieval 477 to 1492, Early Modern 1492 to 1814, 19th century 1814 to 1914, and the World War 1914 to 1919. The events and international complications since the war are so significant, however, that a new section has been added under the title of the post-war period. In this section are reviewed the provisions of the adjustments stated in the Treaty of Versailles, the applications of the treaty, and the departures from the text of this treaty and from previous treaties during the last decade. Then follows the section devoted to national histories, that is, to the histories of the independent nations now existent, arranged on the plan of a narrative summary of the development of each country, followed by a brief chronology of the most important events down to the present day in the order in which they took place. This plan of a separate treatment of the development of the principal countries in the world from their appearance in human history down to the year 1934 has made necessary a rearrangement of materials, principally by the omission of events and tendencies which later experience has shown to be less significant than they seemed a quarter a century ago. This rearrangement makes available the necessary space for the histories of all existing countries, involving individual treatment and including a brief description of their political and social organizations, products, physical features, population, area, relations with other countries, and status in the world system. The whole thus forms for each country a brief but logically developed historical narrative, together with what is in effect a historical gazeta or gazetteer of the world and its main political divisions. So we're going to scope of chronologies. Old-fashioned chronologies were made up chiefly of the succession of rulers, the carrying on of wars, the conquests of other countries near and far, the struggle of dynasties, and the personalities of great captains. Such characters as Alexander and Caesar and Mohammed were treated as elements in military operations. It has been the aim of this historical summary to include not only the political and military events of the world, but also yielding to modern ideas concerning the value and usefulness of chronologies, to record outstanding social, industrial, and literary achievements, great inventions, the founding of new religions, the publication of momentous books, the appearance of new modes of transportation, are all as much a part of history as are battles, sieges, and sudden deaths. National histories. The larger portion of the work is devoted to the national histories. The chronologies of this part are meant to establish dates of special significance in the history of the particular country under consideration. But wars and treaties, international congresses and agreements, and kindred events always extend their effect to more than one country. The discovery of a new explosive, the introduction of motor-driven vehicles, mechanical improvements in airships go as far in altering the development of a country as a victory or a defeat or the assassination of a national leader. Such events are in this work generally treated as in the chronology of each of the countries involved, the various incidents being linked by cross references so that the reader may approach them from various angles. The publishers and the editors have no purpose of assessing the character of modern governments. They aim only to bring within brief compass carefully prepared and authenticated statements as to what has actually taken place in the important nations of the earth. Naturally, an American dictionary, the latest in the long succession of Webster dictionaries, gives special attention to the United States of America, including sketches of each of the states, territories, and dependencies, followed by brief chronologies of the most important events. In revising the work on the state governments, Professor Conover has availed himself of the aid of officials of the state governments and has made use of new material on the histories of the states, bringing down to date the principal events in each. The material, as it now appears, will be of special value in the investigation of state governments, constitutions and constitutional amendments, and of electoral and judicial alterations of the plan of government. It is a key to important events and achievements not only as they affect the separate states, but also in their broader relation to and effect upon national congress, public welfare, and changes in governmental organization. Directly after the section on the states and dependencies is one devoted to the President of the United States, consisting of a concise narrative summary of the chief incidents in the public and private career of each president, followed by a brief chronology of the important dates of his life. The important section in the national histories containing the historical outline and organization of the Dominion of Canada. So now we are on to Canada. And of the Canadian provinces has been written by George M. Wrong, professor of history in the University of Toronto. In part 2, so we're now in alphabetic arrangement. In part 2, the plan is to treat every nation that is independent as one of the family of nations and to place it in its alphabetical position in this arrangement. According to this method, those countries that are parts of an empire or nation, such as dependencies and colonies, are treated under the history of that empire of nation or nation. The name of each such constituent country, dependency, etc., is also entered in its alphabetical position with a reference to the main country of which it is a part. Part 2 is thus on a strictly alphabetical basis. Notwithstanding the difficult task of getting definite information on some of the newer nations, especially in their later aspects, the searcher for data will find the most recent information under the name of that country, except in the case of a few countries whose status has not been permanently settled since the World War. The table of contents on the page following this preface shows at a glance the location of the sections, and any desired details should be found through the index of the reference history. The intention is to make the world history and national history section of this work as convenient and comprehensive as possible, so as to serve the needs alike of the casual inquirer, the reader, the student, and the research worker. A special index to the whole history, so in the index, a special index to the whole history is placed at the end of this volume. Its aim is to open the way to all references to persons, places, events, etc., each under a specific name or word. In addition to these specific references, much information on any particular subject may be found indexed under topics so that the index serves also as a topical analysis. Special features of national histories. It will be noted that some of the national histories and chronologies, especially those of European nations, begin with the year 1648, when, by the Treaty of Westphalia, the map of Europe was largely remade and the political status of Europe largely determined, in a form which lasted until the World War. The Treaty of Versailles of 1919 established a large group of new or altered countries in Europe and also wrought many changes in the colonial possessions of European powers. The most important events of the greater European states previous to 1648 make up the bulk of entries in the medieval period and early modern period down to that date. Such events are therefore noted in the world history and omitted from the national histories. Though general cross-references direct the reader to the sections where such earlier national events may be found, the matters chronicled are very numerous, and if not found in the world history section, should be looked for in the national history section. Two services in mind. Throughout this historical portion of the dictionary, two services have been especially kept in mind. The first is to help the reader in a way similar to that of the vocabulary of the dictionary by enabling him to find out quickly just when a thing happened. Even the experienced investigator may often help himself by making sure of a date that is the point of departure for further research. The other service is to show how the present organization of the world has come about. If the investigator desires to find out from this record a succession of events, the chronologies will bring him vividly to his mind how in the history of the human race a cause produces an effect which in turn becomes the cause of the next effect. Thus, the student of the World War and its consequences will find in the historical outlines of the various countries during the last 20 years, and particularly in the narrative account and in the chronologies of the world history for that period, many of the details of that great conflict and the important events of the years following. Further study of the decades immediately preceding 1914 will enable him to discover some of the essential reasons for the hostilities that led to the war. We have illustrations and maps. Special attention is called to the full page photo gravures, and maps in color, prepared exclusively for the reference history. All the illustrations are entirely new and present a remarkably fine selection from types of the chief government building structures famous in history, World War monuments, and notable high buildings. The 4 pages of portraits of the presidents of the United States are of particular interest. The historical maps provide accurate geographical information, and on the modern maps, the latest official spelling of names is used in conformity with the revision of the gazetteer in the main part of the dictionary. Collaboration in editing. The responsibility for both the accuracy and the usefulness of this work must fall upon the general editor and those who have cooperated in producing this section of the dictionary. William S. Ferguson, Professor of Ancient and Modern History at Harvard University, has prepared a section on ancient history, both in the preceding and present edition. For the medieval period, Charles Howard McIlwain, Professor of Science of Government at Harvard, is the authority. The editor-in-chief is responsible for the early modern period and the 19th century period in the present edition. The period from the outbreak of the World War to the present day, World War period and post-war period has been the province of Professor Bernadette E. Schmidt of the University of Chicago. Everett Kimball, Professor of Government at Smith College, has prepared all the historical outlines and chronologies on the national histories, as well as the lives of the Presidents of the United States. For the important work on the states, territories, and dependencies of the United States, including both historical outlines and chronology, Professor Milton Conover of Yale University has provided the material. Backed by the responsibility of these first-hand investigators, authors, and teachers, the editor feels confident in the accuracy of the work both as to the facts, dates, and results of important historical events. His main work has been to make plans in conjunction with the experts of the G&C Merriam firm to apportion the work and carefully to read and discuss the manuscript submitted by the associate editors. Errors and misprints may be found in the most carefully reviewed sections of such a work in spite of the learning of the contributors and the care of the editor, but it is hoped that they have been reduced to a minimum by the repeated scratches to perfect the matter in copy and in proof. The purpose of editor, contributors, and publishers has been to help people of all kinds, experts, librarians, authors, educators, public men, and general readers, to find their way to exact information on the subjects treated in this part of the dictionary. The aim of all concerned in the production of this edition of Webster's Dictionary is to aid its users to understand the world in which they live. Albert Bushnell Hart. So that was the preface. We have the contents. All right. I'm not going to read the contents. So I just scroll through slowly so that you could glance and probably pause and read. What I want to just mention to you guys is that this is not the full version of the book. So as we go through the book and we read the ancient histories, you'll realize that it jumps from page number to page number. It's not in exact order, but the information is still so beautiful and so appreciative. I give respect and kudos to these guys who put together this information. Right? So you'll see as we go through, some of the pages jump from page to page, so it may not be running in chronological order, as it's not the complete book. Is a copy of the a PDF copy. All right. So part one: world history, ancient period, earliest time, from the earliest time to 476 AD. I think I want to make this a bit bigger. Some people may not be able to see it properly. Just know that we'll have to scroll between the pages. All right, hopefully you guys can see it better here. So historical outline. So a discussion of ancient history covers the field from the origin of man upon the earth down to some arbitrarily fixed date. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, 476 AD, is usually taken as the date at which ancient history ends. For the greater part of this period, no absolute chronology exists. In the first epochs, time is reckoned not by years, but by genealogical ages, and even after man left, remains from which his history may be reconstructed, dynasties and eras give a more correct idea of the passage of time than do uncertain dates. According to the testimony of genealogy and anthropology, man existed on the earth in the early Stone Age, which is placed between 50,000 and 125,000 years ago. After the third descent of the polar ice cap and during the third long warm interval, traces of man during this period are found, and his primitive culture may be reconstructed from the stone implements buried in the glacial drift. The Middle Stone Age occurred during the fourth descent of the ice cap, in which period mankind was driven south or took refuge in caves and adapted himself to the altered conditions. The latter Stone Age began between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago with the fourth warm interval, which still continues. It was in the latter Stone Age that actual historical records were first made, and from that period onward, various nations have arisen at different times and have developed their cultures. The Egyptian Empire along the Lower Nile in Africa was the home of one of the two earliest civilizations of which authentic historic record was preserved. By means of picture writing and hieroglyphs, as well as by buildings, sculptures, and articles of use that have been preserved, the culture and civilization of the early Egyptians may be studied. The earliest fixed date in history is determined by the Egyptian invention of a calendar 4241 BC. How long the Egyptian Empire had existed before this here, there is no means of knowing, nor can it be determined when the race emerged from the latter Stone Age. At the same time, though, by independent development, emerged the Old Babylonian Empire. The plain through which the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow was occupied by Sumerians and Semites long before 3500 BC, and city kingdoms were founded and a culture developed, records of which have been preserved to us by the system of cuneiform writing. The Semitic people, who were descendants of the nomads occupying the Arab land desert, mastered the entire valley, and in the age of Sargon 2870 BC, a Semitic empire was established which exhibited much of the Sumerian culture. This composite empire lasted perhaps until the 23rd century BC, when it was displaced by a new Semitic invasion, that of the Amorites of Syria. And the supremacy of Babylon was then established under Hammurabi. I have a translated code of Hammurabi, so you guys could just remind me to read it in the comments. Okay. So farther north, on the upper course of the Tigris, was the Assyrian Empire. There, sometime before 3000 BC, the Semitic nomads of the desert settled at Ashur. They came alternately under the influence of the Babylonians to the south, to whom they were vassals, and of the Hittites in the west, and drew their culture particularly from the Aramaeans or Syrians. During the reign of Sennacherib 705 to 681 BC, Babylon and Judah were conquered. A vast empire was developed. So Nineveh was refounded as the capital city and an elaborate administration was developed. The Assyrian army proved invincible. The Assyrian Empire fell before the onslaught of the Chaldeans, and under Nebuchadnezzar 604 to 561 BC. Babylon was the home of the highest civilization yet developed. While these Semitic kingdoms were developing in the Tigris Euphrates Valley, Other Semitic people, like the Arameans and the Hebrews in Syria and Palestine, though reaching no such material grandeur, developed a culture even more important. Particularly was this true of the Hebrews, who gave to the world the monotheistic idea. The Medo-Persian Empire developed northwest of the Persian Gulf, founded not by a Semitic people, but by a branch of the great Indo-European family. About 550 BC, under Cyrus the Persian, the Macdes were defeated and the foundations laid for an empire which rapidly expanded. The Chaldean Empire of Babylon was overthrown and the Semitic East collapsed before the invaders from the north. In 525, Egypt was conquered by the Persian Cambyses, and under Darius, the Persians developed an administrative system which rivaled that of the early Assyrians. Another branch of the great Indo-European family pushed into India and reached the Ganges, perhaps as early as 1500 BC. There they developed a culture based on the caste system, and their religion was Brahmanism, which embodied the doctrine of transmigration of the soul. In the 5th century BC, Buddhism was developed and for a time displaced Brahmanism, but was gradually driven out of India proper. It still flourishes, however, in Eastern Asia, where it numbers as its adherents nearly a third of the human race. Still further to the east, the Chinese civilization was developed. This came neither from the Semitic nor from the Indo-European race, but from the Turanians, who settled in the valley of the Ilwo sometime before 3000 BC. I think the word is Huang. So I'm going to read that again. So, still farther to the east, the Chinese civilization was developed. This came neither from the Semitic nor from the Indo-European race, but from the Turanians, who settled in the valley of the Huangho, sometime before 3000 BC. Here was developed the Confucian religion, which ranks in number of adherents next to Buddhism. The Chinese at a very early era developed a system of pictorial writing from which modern Chinese characters were developed. A literature, the most prized portion of which is included in the nine classes, was developed sometime before the 3rd century BC. In the 3rd century, moreover, was built the Great Chinese Wall as a defense against the Huns. The Hittite Empire existed in Asia Minor between 1450 and 1250 BC. The Hittites served as the great connecting link between the East and the West, and although they developed a culture of their own, which, as has been seen, influenced some of the Semitic empires, it was as carriers of culture from one region to another that the Hittites were most important. In the Mediterranean at Troy, 2500 to 1500 BC, and the Mycenae in Greece, 1600 to 1200, and at Knossos in Crete, 2100 to 1400, a civilization was developed which has been described by the poet Homer. Excavations have later proved that this civilization existed long before the Greek invasion, and it is now called the Minoan, Cretan, Mycenaean, or Aegean. It was characterized by vast places and buildings and a profusion of gold. Great advances were made in architecture and engineering, and the metalworks developed extraordinary skill. This civilization fell before the invasion of another branch of the Indo-European race, the Greeks. Contrary to the formally accepted opinion of history, the Greeks on their entrance into the Balkan Peninsula were still in the barbaric nomadic stage of culture. Beginning about 2000 BC, the Greeks, in a series of invasions, attacked and overthrew the Mycenaean states they found. But the conquered gave to their conquerors their culture, and the Greeks, taking what was best from the Mycenaean civilization, developed in their little city-states a civilization superior to any that the world had yet seen. About the 8th century BC, the Greeks began to send out colonies and settled on the islands and shores of the Aegean Sea not yet occupied by them. In Sicily and Italy, and even in southern France. These colonies spread the Greek ideas, Greek trade, and Greek culture throughout the Mediterranean basins. Coming into conflict with the Persian Empire in the 5th century, they held their own against Darius and Xerxes and maintained their independence. Later in the same century, Athens, under Pericles, was the center of a classic culture which has never been equaled. The independence of the Greek city-states gave way before the growth of the Macedonian Empire under Alexander the Great. Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and even India were brought, at least for a time, under Greek control. More important than the conquest of these countries was the diffusion of the Greek culture, which in a decadent form continued throughout ancient history and even into medieval times. In Italy, city-states were founded by the Etruscians, a people of uncertain origins, perhaps contemporary, contemporary with the building of the city-states in Greece. The Italians followed with small states, of which Rome, the legendary date of whose foundation is 753 BC, was the most important. At an early date, a republican form of government was established and a military system developed which enabled the Romans to conquer the surrounding tribes and gradually to extend their dominion over Italy south of the Po. In so doing, they came into contact with the Greek colonies in Italy and Sicily. Even more important was their conflict with the Carthaginians. Carthaginians. This was their first non-Italian campaign, and the success of the Romans eliminated the Semitic Phoenician state as a possible rival in the Mediterranean. After this first foreign war, the Roman conquest proceeded rapidly. First Greece, then Asia Minor and Syria, then Gaul and Britain were subdued, until by the reign of Augustus I, Roman Emperor, 27 BC, 14 AD, all the countries adjacent to the Mediterranean Sea were included in his dominion. Although expanded under Trajan, the boundaries of Rome remained substantially the same until the onslaught of the barbarians. So just as the Greeks and Romans had overthrown an earlier civilization, so the Romans themselves succumbed to barbarian invasions from the north and east. This process beginning perhaps with the onslaught of the, the, the Cimbri and Teutones 113 to 101 BC became serious with the invasion of the, the Marcomanni in 180 AD. With ever increasing frequency and intensity, the Teutonic tribes pushed into the empire and founded Germanic kingdoms. In 476 AD, the last emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was dethroned by, by, by Odessa, the leader of Herulians, and the Roman Empire in the West was at an end. Chronology. Based on ancient chronology, to construct an exact chronology of ancient history from the earliest times is quite impossible. The reason for this is obvious. Such a chronology requires not only contemporaneous and continuous historical records or writings embodying them, which are frequently wanting, but also a fixed method of reckoning years, an era, or some other similar device must have been adopted. The need, however, of this is felt only after a long period of civilization. The Egyptians, with all their care to preserve records of events, had no historical era. If they dated at all, with very few exceptions, they dated only by the years of their sovereigns. From this fact, with the fragmentary character of their monuments and literature, and with the possible synchronism of dynasties, arises the great difficulty of determining the Egyptian chronology. The Assyrians, during the latter part of their history, had an exact method of reckoning years. They named each year after an officer, usually called by us an eponym. Lists of these eponyms have been discovered, several copies, all of which closely agree, covering the period from 893 to 666 BC. From the record of a total eclipse, 763 BC, is determined the dates of all these years. These Assyrian canon from the mention of Ahab, Jehu or Yehu, so Uzziah, and a few other kings of Israel and Yahuda or Judah in the Assyrian annals has fixed the periods of these monarchs and compelled a modification of the previous understanding of Old Testament chronology. The Hebrews seem to have preserved but few records of their early history, and the lapses of time give in the Old Testament from the period of creation down to the fall of Jerusalem are in a large degree conjectural. In addition to the Assyrian canon for determining dates of partially the same period, there is the canon of Ptolemy, of Ptolemy or Ptolemy, a chronological compilation with astronomical notes of Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman kings commencing 747 BC and extending to 137 AD. This, so far as tested, has proved an accurate and reliable document and has been of the greatest service in determining ancient chronology. For the periods of Babylonian and Assyrian history earlier than these canons, there are lists of monarchs with the length of their reigns going back to 3200 BC. These lists have not been preserved or discovered entirely without breaks. Alright, this part here a bit not printed properly, but I'll still try my best to read it. Lists of magistrates or priests preserved in temples or in archives of state were, were the basis of the ordinary Greek chronology. Uh, Designates the year of the outbreak of the Pseudo-Phoenician War as the 48th year of the priestess Ciricis at Argos when I can't see the rest of information there. Was Ephora at Sparta and Pythodons was Akron at Athens. So from our 500 BC to 293 BC, we a complete list of the Athenians or Atlanteans, Arch, Archons, and for the earlier period from the establishment of the office of 683 BC in 683 BC, and for the later period to 265 AD, an incomplete list. This method of reckoning by local magistrates or priests was never wholly abandoned, but in the 3rd century BC, though Macedonian kings of Syria compete completed the years of their reign from the founding of the dynasty in 312 BC and the era thus established, the, the era of the I can't see that one act, an example widely followed in later Greek and Roman times. After the 4th century BC, Greek historians reckon chiefly from the Olympian Games, which were held in 776 BC and once in 4 years thereafter for more than a millennium. Thus, the invasion of Greece by Xerxes fell in the first year of the 75th Olympiad or 480 BC. The Romans dated an event by giving the name of the two men in whose consulship the event occurred, or occasionally and less formally by giving the name of one consul. That last part there was really butchered, guys. I do apologize for that. So formal lists of the consuls were kept as a part of the public record. Some copies of these lists in Latin and in Greek have been preserved and may be found in the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, Volume 1. They form the basis of Roman chronology. But it is probable that the public records were destroyed when Rome was captured by the Gauls, 390 BC, and that the lists of the years 509 to 390 were made up from priestly records or from traditions. For the earlier years before the expulsion of the kings, the dates rest upon tradition or legend and have little value. The date of the founding of the city, 753 BC, however, was universally accepted by the Romans and was occasionally used as a date to reckon from, especially when the period of time that had elapsed was regarded as significant. The system of reckoning ad urbe condita is modern and conventional. In medieval and modern times, historians of antiquity long continued to compute time from the founding of Rome or the first year of Abraham, 2017 BC, or the creation of the world, or some similar point. But since the end of the 18th century, the practice of dating events before as well as after the birth of Christ from a point which is fixed as midnight between December 31st, 1 BC, and January 1st, 1 AD has come into general use. Astronomers, however, have taken a whole year, 1 BC, as their point of departure, designating it 0, so that the year 323 BC example appears on their calculations as 322 BC. In this chronological history, the dates of the early Egyptian dynasties, so I is 1 to XV, II is Roman numerals for 18. So 10 and 5 is 15 and 3 is 8. So XVII are from the chronology of Edward Mayer and Breasted, which are always the latest that can be given for Egyptian eras. The much earlier dates current are now pretty generally abandoned by Egyptologists. The dates for Babylonian, Assyrian, and Jewish history are based on the chronology of the Cambridge Ancient History and Albert Tenek Olmsted's History of Palestine and Syria. The following dates may be received as only approximate. Babylonian and Assyrian dates before the 19th century BC, Biblical dates before the middle of the 7th century BC, Greek dates before the middle of the 6th century BC, and Roman dates before the beginning of the 3rd century BC. Many dates subsequent to these periods cannot be exactly fixed, and hence they are given differently by historical authorities. Sometimes differences arise from different modes of reckoning. Some writers, for example, count as the first year of a ruler the year in the course of which he came to the throne. Others begin with the first full calendar year of his reign. So, right, so we're going into the Eastern nations and Judea. All right, so I'm going to stop there and we're going to pick up from the Eastern nations and Judea in part 2. All right. All right, guys. Thanks for your patience and attention. I do apologize for this last paragraph here. Really not printed properly. I was unable to really make out some of the words. But I hope you guys got the gist of it. So we're going to take up from Eastern nations and Judea, part 2. Thank you.